Whereas if it was objectively true, the idea is that that truth comes from the world, right? Not our minds, and so is not subject to that sort of bias. So the idea here is that if you say that the world is round and that that is an objective truth, well, then it doesn't matter that some people think that the earth is flat, right? And it doesn't matter that some people believe that the earth is round. It is either round or flat, irregardless of what people think, right? So that's objective truth. Whereas subjective truth, again, would say that no, its truth or falsity just depends on what someone believes, right? So this, I think, is better captured by statements of opinion, right? So like if I say chocolate is the best flavor ice cream, that could be true for me and false for you, and it's not like one of us is correct and the other one is incorrect, right? Because the truth literally depends upon who is making that judgment. Relativism is like taking the view of subjectivity to the extreme. There you're saying that everything is subjective, right? That there are only things, the only type of truth is truth dependent on a mind, right? And this is really problematic because this makes knowledge and its use in the world really inconsistent, right? If I can just believe whatever I want and you can believe whatever you want and we're both right, how do we negotiate and move forward as a group, right? So with regard to traditional conceptions of knowledge, sex and gender, even in discussing notions of subjectivity and relativism, were assumed to be irrelevant to what someone could know, right? So the idea is whether or not you liked something, even if you thought that was subjective, there was never a discussion of what role sex or gender played in your personal circumstances, right? And that's going to be a big problem. And of course, as we can gather, this is also going to be true with other intersectional identities, primarily race and socioeconomic status. So to compare, right, traditional epistemologists have had this problem where they don't take the sex or gender of the knower into account, right, at all, whether we're talking about objectivism, subjectivity, whatever it is. The sex, gender, race, socioeconomic status, none of that mattered in theory to whether or not you could know something. Whereas standpoint theorists and feminist epistemologists are going to say that that stuff absolutely matters. And so they're going to give us a different conception of kinds of knowers. So the atomistic knower is someone who is individualistic, right, generic, interchangeable, doesn't rely on other people to get to know something, right? You're just sort of judging it on that individual, right? It denies the epistemic relevance of aspects of your identity and social locations. Again, it makes gender totally irrelevant to what you can know, and ignores more complex forms of knowledge, which include emotional responses, right? But what's more important is that it also ignores the social interactions which make knowledge possible, right? We very rarely come to know something just on our own. Most of our knowledge comes from trust in certain communities, right, as experts and sources of authoritative testimony. So the kinds of knowers that we see in feminist epistemology are not atomistic in this way. They are entirely situated. And they can be situated in one of three ways. You can focus on the individual, right, which is known as differentiated situational knowers. Interactive or relational situated knowers, which here has a relationship between an individual and an institution, right? So that's sort of one to a larger group. Or you can have communal, more as a web, right, where individuals can have knowledge, but it's never going to be independent from that larger community in which they're a part. So different ideas, we don't need to focus too much on those. But the idea is that with any one of these, you are going to be taking into account the specific situation of the person in all of the intersectional ways that we've been talking about, and that those aspects of their identity will have a direct correlation to what they can know. And probably more importantly, what they possibly cannot know. This is sort of a radical idea, right? So the idea is that if your identity will determine your knowledge, it's not only going to say what you will have greater knowledge on, but also what you maybe are less knowledgeable about. Okay, and so the idea is that there are going to be some experiences which cannot be accessed based on one's sexed body and gender roles in society. And I'm going to lay out how this works, right? But the basic underlying principle is that this creates a sort of relativism that can't be totally avoided, right? We want to make sure that we're taking the subjective experience of each individual into account, right? So we're kind of abandoning the traditional notion of objectivity. But we don't want it to collapse into complete relativism because, again, we need knowledge to be able to work for us in an instrumental way. So standpoint theory is going to try to navigate this. How can we account for the subjective experience while avoiding relativism entirely? So the idea here is to talk about us again as they sort of have to generalize in this way to sort of paint this picture that we can sort of group people together by their various intersectional identities, and that those aspects of their identity will create an overall status that they probably have or location in society, right, in terms of sex, gender, sexuality, race, religious affiliation, socioeconomic status, right, all of these things. And that will have a direct correlation to what their epistemic position is. In other words, what position they're in to come to know something or to be the most justified, right, or considered to have the best perspective on an issue. And the idea with standpoint theory is that these two things are in an inverse relationship with one another, meaning that the greater privilege you have in society, the less epistemic privilege you have about those correlative areas. Now, this doesn't work for everything, right? This doesn't mean that if you're the most marginalized, you're the most brilliant, right? What it has to do with certain domains of knowledge. So let's take issues of sexual orientation, for example, right? The basic idea here is, using these diagrams on the right, is that the greater socioeconomic privilege you have, so in terms of sexual orientation, we know that we live in a heteronormative society, right? So the default sort of presumed sexual orientation of everyone is heterosexual, right? Which has resulted in the marginalization and oppression of people who do not identify as heterosexual. So let's take a simple example here to weed out all the other potential intersectional identities. Let's say we are dealing with two men. They, in this case, both happen to be Caucasian. They both happen to be Christian. They both happen to come from middle-class families in the Midwest. The only difference, for the sake of this example, is that one of these men identifies as heterosexual and the other man identifies as homosexual. Okay? Now, because of our heteronormative society, we know that the heterosexual male is likely, again, right, we're making a generalization here, but is likely to experience greater socioeconomic privilege, right? Because throughout our history, gay men have been very much punished, right? Not just in their personal lives, but also in their professional lives and by the law, right, for being gay. Okay, so the idea here is that the greater socioeconomic privilege you have in one particular domain, the less epistemic privilege you have. So what that means is that the straight male, in this case, will know less about sexuality and sexual orientation than the gay man, right? So the gay man, having experienced less socioeconomic privilege, again, making a generalization, that means that they will have greater epistemic privilege in this domain, right? So that means that the gay man will know more, or is likely to know more about sexuality and sexual orientation than the straight man. So why is this? Why is there an inverse relationship between socioeconomic privilege and epistemic privilege? In standpoint theory, this is called dual vision. The idea here is that when you experience oppression and marginalization in a society, you actually get to see things through both your own perspective, right, of marginalization and oppression, but you're also able to understand the world through the dominant perspective, meaning that not only do you know what it's like to be gay through your own experience, but you also know what it's like to be straight, because that is the sort of sexual relationship that has been perpetuated throughout your entire life. You've probably seen many more instances and representations of straight couples and relationships, of straight men, how those men are supposed to behave, right? those sort of social norms. You maybe have been presumed most of your life to be straight, right? People might make that default presumption of you.